Imagine the world not as a map, but as a multi-layered cipher, where each clue unlocks not a door, but the next deception. We're accustomed to considering ancient pyramids and lost civilizations as mysteries, but true enigmas lie quieter, deeper, closer. Just lift the edge of familiar reality, and things that shouldn't exist appear. Today, we'll explore 20 little-known mysteries from around the world, shrouded in mystery that scientists have been unable to solve for centuries. Echo Labyrinth of Hyburn. On the west coast of Ireland, there's a hill that locals avoid even during the day. They call it Hyburn and say briefly, "Where the voices remember unnecessary things." Hidden within the hill is a network of damp passages, resembling the roots of a giant tree. But the point isn't the depth or the darkness. The real action begins when a person utters their first word. According to legend, the labyrinth predates the first monasteries and even ancient stone circles. Some attribute it to the Druids, others to an unknown people who retreated underground. The entrances to the halls are uneven. The walls are laid without mortar, as if the stones found their own place. And there is no inscription or symbol anywhere that would suggest who built it or why. The first thing those who dare to descend notice is a strange silence. Footsteps seem muffled, and the sound of breathing becomes thick and heavy. But as soon as a word is spoken, the silence breaks. The echo doesn't respond immediately. Several seconds pass between the phrase and its reflection, sometimes half a minute, sometimes much longer, and this is only the beginning of the anomaly. A local guide told a story about a pair of tourists. They were arguing in one of the halls, shouting loudly, and then wearily fell silent. A few minutes later, as they were walking down a narrow corridor toward the exit, the air around them came alive. The labyrinth began to return each line, one by one, but not exactly as it had been spoken. The phrases became jumbled, reordered, and the meaning became entirely different, aggressive. There's another, more disturbing detail. Sometimes the echo speaks words the person hasn't yet spoken. A group of researchers claim to have heard a question from the darkness that one of them asked only minutes later. At first they thought they were mistaken, but the recording confirmed it. The question was asked twice, and the first time, it seemed to come from the future. Attempts to explain the phenomenon scientifically have been made numerous times. One expedition brought highly sensitive microphones and sound-reflecting equipment. The official report was cautious. A complex system of passages, multiple reflections, and unusual geology. But the participants themselves whispered that the equipment sometimes recorded complete silence, while they heard voices with their own ears. The labyrinth functions as a strange acoustic trap. Sounds here aren't simply reflected, but rather linger, rewritten, and return to another time. Some believe the stone is imbued with every word spoken beneath the vaults, and then suddenly plays the recording back, not in full, but in fragments, as if an alien memory lives underground, uncontrolled. Locals hold Hyburn in superstitious reverence. They believe the labyrinth doesn't welcome unnecessary questions. Before entering, one must not pronounce one's name, mention the dead, or make promises one cannot keep. It's believed that the echo remembers such words especially well, bringing them back at the most painful moment when one is least prepared to hear them. Sometimes in the village, they tell tales of rare daredevils who spent only an hour in the labyrinth, only to discover on the surface that half a day had passed. There are no wristwatches or instruments in these stories, only a subjective feeling. Time stretches or compresses below. And this is especially frightening when you remember the echo that can outpace words. The strangest thing about the Hyburn Echo Labyrinth is that it's barely mentioned in tourist guides. Only locals, a few persistent explorers, and those who once heard their own voice there at the wrong time know about it. And while the same well-known mysteries are marked on the world map, somewhere in the Irish hinterland, there's a place where even a word can come back to you in a different way. Brighter's glowing drops, In northern Sweden, there's a small lake locally called Brighter. During the day, it seems ordinary. Cold water, scattered pine trees, a rocky shore. But at night, especially when the wind is calm, its surface comes alive. Tiny glowing dots begin to glide across the surface, like drops of dew falling on a mirror. They move slowly, sometimes changing direction, and always against the wind. The first stories about the drops appeared in village chronicles. Old people claimed to have seen them in childhood and their grandmothers in their youth. But no one could explain the phenomenon. The light was too soft for insect lights, too cool for moonlight, and too orderly for random biological luminescence. The drops appeared in groups, as if following some sort of unique path. Each drop is barely noticeable, like a tiny sphere of light the size of a grain of grain. They flash silently, moving in a straight line or in a gentle arc, and then disappear, as if someone turned them off. But the strangest thing is that their movement is always against the wind. Even if the water ripples slightly, the drops seem to glide along their own path, unaffected by either the current or the gusts. One day, a group of biologists ventured out onto Brighter Lake, determined to check whether the phenomenon was caused by a rare species of algae. They took samples from all parts of the lake but found nothing unusual. Not a single trace of substances characteristic of natural luminescence. The water was clear and perfectly normal. Then the researchers decided to track the droplets from a boat. They floated alongside, recording their coordinates, measuring wind direction and vibrations. But the droplets moved as if someone were guiding them through invisible tunnels. Locals believe the glowing drops appear only when the lake breathes. This expression, they say, signifies the moment when the air and water temperatures equalize and a thin layer of silence seems to form over the surface. On such nights, even the surrounding forest becomes quieter. The birds are silent, the animals do not rustle in the bushes. Everything seems to freeze, allowing the phenomenon to manifest. Legend has it that the Brighter drops are the traces of those who lived in these areas long before the first settlements. Supposedly, the inhabitants of this vanished people marked their paths through the swamps and waters with their own lighted signs. Some villagers believe the drops are their remaining trace, appearing each time the lake retraces its old roots. But there's another, more frightening version. Several fishermen admitted to seeing the glowing dots not simply floating, but seemingly forming a shape. One described the droplets as forming a thin line, resembling the outline of a hand. Another claimed to have noticed a shape resembling the silhouette of a head. These descriptions are too vague to be taken literally, but combined with the strange behavior of the droplets, they create the impression that there is someone in the lake, not something. A couple of years ago, a tourist filmed a long sequence of droplets appearing. And upon closer inspection, it was clear. The movement of the glowing dots resembled a peculiar pattern. Not letters, not symbols, but something resembling geometric designs. Scientists tried to explain it as a random consequence of waves, but the patterns repeated themselves over and over again, as if following a single script. Another strange observation involves sound. Some witnesses say that when the drops appear, the air around the lake becomes thicker, and any sound, footsteps, breathing, rustling, seems slightly muffled. It's as if nature itself takes a deep breath before the phenomenon. And this sensation, witnesses say, is far more frightening than the glowing dots themselves. Despite attempts to investigate the phenomenon, no one has yet found an explanation. There is no instrumental evidence to suggest a material source for the light. There are no biological samples, no chemical reactions, no reflections. Only quiet nights, smooth water, and tiny luminous droplets appearing where they shouldn't be. Today, Lake Brighter remains one of the most tranquil yet strangest spots on the map of northern Europe. While some consider it a natural anomaly, others are convinced the glowing drops are not a natural phenomenon, but someone's silent attempt to attract attention, or to warn. chronomirrors of Altai. High in the Altai Mountains, where trails become barely perceptible lines among the rocks, there is a valley that shepherds call a place of torn time. At first glance, it looks no different from hundreds of others: sparse larch trees, rock falls, narrow streams. But in certain areas where the cliffs form natural walls, things happen that are difficult to explain by conventional laws. The first stories about these zones came from hunters. They claim to have noticed strange sensations while crossing the valley, as if the air were getting thicker and their steps were heavier. But the real trouble began when they tried to tell time. Clocks would gain or lose, sometimes by a few minutes, sometimes by an entire hour. Some claimed that time jerked as if trying to run backward. The most unusual place is located between two sheer cliffs that stand almost parallel to each other. The path between them is narrow, just a few steps wide. Those who have passed through it have reported an instantaneous shift in their sense of reality. Some heard distant rustling sounds that weren't there before. Others saw misty silhouettes like reflections in a distorted mirror. Hence the name, chronomirrors. A hunter named Kaisar recalled crossing this trail one day at dusk. Before entering, he glanced at the sun, which was already touching the horizon. But as he passed between the rocks and looked back, he saw it was brighter than it should have been. The sun seemed to have risen higher. He thought he had been mistaken, but when he reached a familiar clearing, it turned out that less time had passed than he had felt. He said it was as if he had returned to a moment that no longer existed. Shepherds also reported strange occurrences. One claimed to have seen his dog run ahead, turn around a rock, and disappear. A few seconds later, it reappeared, but not from the direction it had turned, but from the opposite direction. There were no branches there. The shepherd is still convinced. The animal had entered a place where space and time are entangled. Sometimes sounds resembling a human voice are heard in the valley, but muffled and drawn out, as if someone were speaking underwater. These sounds always remain in one place and disappear if one approaches. Researchers who have visited the region have suggested that this may be an unusual echo between the rocks. However, locals are certain that it is not an echo, but rather the imprint of those who have passed through here before. There are even more disturbing stories. Several travelers reported that, upon entering one of these mirrored places, they saw their own figure a few steps away. Not a reflection, but a figure standing among the stones. It moved with a slight delay, as if mimicking their actions, but not entirely. When they attempted to approach, the silhouette dissolved into thin air, leaving behind a faint shimmer of light. Scientists have sought an explanation for the phenomenon in the properties of rocks and their ability to distort magnetic fields. But even the most cautious experts admit that such strong and consistent deviations should not occur, especially in areas without large mineral deposits capable of such an effect. Locals believe the valley is a boundary, not between worlds, but between layers of reality. They say that in such places, time doesn't treat humans as masters. It shifts, stretches, and compresses, leaving traces that later manifest as voices, delays, and silhouettes. And if you linger there longer than necessary, you can see not only your own reflection, but also what once was or will be. The Altai chronomirrors remain one of the region's quietest yet most terrifying mysteries. While scientists search for geophysical anomalies, those who have visited them are certain of one thing: this place isn't about stones and winds. It's about time, which sometimes decides to play a game of its own with humans. Weeping Gate of Belder. In southern Turkey, among the hills where ancient paths have long been overgrown with grass, stands a stone gate known locally as Belder. It doesn't lead to a fortress, a temple, or any other structure. It's simply an arch of large stone blocks in the middle of a desert landscape. But even shepherds rarely approach it, because the gate emits a sound reminiscent of a prolonged groan or a quiet cry, and it does so only when a certain phase of the moon rises above it. The gates appear crude, as if assembled by unskilled hands. The stones are uneven, covered in cracks, and their surface bears traces of deep scratches. But the most striking feature is the holes drilled into the upper slabs. They are arranged in a precise pattern, reminiscent of a pattern but unlike any known symbol. Wind passes through these holes, producing a low, voice-like sound. However, the strangeness lies not in the sound itself, but in the conditions under which it occurs. Locals noticed that the gates began to cry only on nights when the moon was in a certain position. Moreover, the sound was independent of wind strength. There were nights when a storm rumbled in the hills, but the arch remained silent. And there were others when the air was still, and the gates would suddenly begin to emit a quiet, almost human groan. It always happened unexpectedly, as if someone on the other side of the stone were taking a deep breath. One old man recounted how his father had warned him not to stand under the arch when it cried. It was believed that the gates remembered those who heard their voice too close. This fear was passed on to the locals and became part of local beliefs. People are convinced that the gates don't just make sounds, they seem to respond to the very presence of a person. Several researchers visited Belder to record the arch's voice. They attempted to record wind direction, air temperature, and humidity. But the most intriguing thing was that the sound never repeated exactly the same way. Sometimes it was low and heavy, like a drawn-out sob. Other times it was short and sharp, like a sigh of pain. Some claimed to hear barely audible words in it, though no one could make out a single phrase. One day, a group of archaeologists decided to study the holes in the stone. They noticed that their shape was not random. Each hole was slightly inclined, pointing deeper into the structure, and this created a resonance stronger than usual. But even with this explanation, it remained unclear why the arch's voice only emerged under a specific moonlight. Some suggested that the rays falling on the stone altered the surface temperature, and with it, the airflow. But the magnitude of this change was too small to explain the loudness of the sound. The most disturbing story concerns a young shepherd named Dylan. He claimed to have once heard not just crying from under the arch, but a distinct female voice calling his name. Frightened, he ran home and stayed away for a long time. Village elders said the gate sometimes reflects a person's thoughts if they approach with anxiety in their hearts. Dylan is still convinced he heard something inside the stone, not the wind. Legend has it that the Belder Gate is the remnant of an ancient tomb, eroded by time. Supposedly, statues once stood inside, depicting those who guarded the passage to the underworld. When the tomb was destroyed, only the arch remained, taking on the role of guardian. Wind passes through its openings, bringing to the world a reminder of those buried in these lands. However, there is another, more modern theory. Some researchers believe the gate is a unique musical instrument created by an ancient people, and that the sound we call crying actually reflects a system of knowledge lost centuries ago. Perhaps the arch served as a conduit for rituals associated with the lunar cycles, and its voice is part of an ancient ceremony. But even those who approach Belder with a scientific interest admit, there's something unsettling about the arch. The sound always seems too alive, too close to emotion, sometimes a melancholy, sometimes a warning. The Weeping Gate of Belder has stood on the hill for generations, and everyone who has heard its voice says the same thing. It's not just the wind, it's like a memory of stone that refuses to be forgotten. And as the moon passes again and again, the arch continues to weep, as if reminding people of something they're still not ready to hear. Bezeko Cave, Varanasi. On the outskirts of the ancient Indian city of Varanasi, near the banks of a great river, a small, seemingly unremarkable cave is hidden among the rocks. Locals call it the Echoless Cave. Its entrance is narrow, like a crack, and inside lies a dark chamber where the air seems still. But the most important thing about this place is the absolute impossibility of hearing even the faintest echo. Not a whisper, not a clap, not a loud scream returns to one, as if the sound dissolves into the stone. The first mention of the cave appears in ancient tales of monks who used it as a place of meditation. They believed the silence within allowed them to hear the true voice of the soul. But later, people began to notice even stranger phenomena. Those who delved deeper claimed to lose their sense of space. The walls seemed to recede, or conversely, approach, even though nothing around them changed. The cave's most unusual feature is its ability to absorb sound, not muffle or soften it, but completely absorb it. A person could clap their hands right in front of the stone, but they would only hear the moment of impact without the usual recoil. Scientists attributed this to the rock's complex structure, which includes numerous microcracks that act as absorbers. But even among the researchers, there were those who acknowledged the effect was too strong for normal natural conditions. One of the most famous cases involved a hike by a group of students from a local university. They decided to test the depth at which echoes disappear completely. But after just 5 steps, the sound began to behave strangely. The students clapped and banged on metal objects, but everything disappeared. They recorded their experiments on a voice recorder and discovered that the noise was present, but very faint, as if obscured by a cloth. However, the most astonishing thing was the difference between what the students heard and what the equipment recorded. Some researchers claimed the cave had a strange effect. A person stopped hearing their own heartbeat as clearly as in silence. Usually, in a confined space, one can detect the rhythm of one's blood, one's breathing, even the tinnitus. But Defy takes away even that. Inside, there is no background noise, no vibration, no familiar sense of one's own life. Only a thick, almost viscous silence in which one begins to lose one's sense of self. Locals believe that deep within the cave, what one sees is not sound, but its absence. Elders tell a legend about a sage who, many years ago, meditated here and heard the silence of his ancestors. He claimed that within the cave, one can detect not human sound, but the silence that has existed here for centuries. Not emptiness, but the true essence of silence. However, there are even more disturbing stories. Several travelers reported hearing, while inside, not an echo, but rather faint footsteps behind them. The footsteps were quiet, barely audible, but distinct enough to sense a presence. There was no possibility of any reflected sound. What's particularly disturbing is that the footsteps always stopped precisely when the person turned around. And at that moment, the silence became even thicker. One day, a young monk confided in his mentor that he had heard a whisper deep in the cave. Not loud, but soft, almost gentle. The whisper spoke his name. The mentor didn't scold him. He merely said that the cave sometimes brings back to a person what they've hidden deep within, and that this whisper can be both a reminder and a test. Some researchers have attempted to explain such phenomena through psychological effects. Complete silence can create illusions in humans. The brain, deprived of familiar sound, produces its own noises. But the question remains, why do different people hear the same thing? Why do footsteps seem identical? Why does a name sound so distinct? The strangest thing was observed by those who spent more than an hour inside. They claimed that at some point they began to feel not silence, but a movement of air, as if something were passing by, silently and invisibly. But when they tried to pinpoint its direction, the sensation dissolved. The air returned to stillness, as if nothing had happened. Defy Cave remains one of the most mysterious places in Varanasi. It lacks the usual eerie legends, no ancient curses, no traces of ancient rituals. Only absolute silence, too dense to be natural. And people who emerge from there often say the same thing. There's something alive in that silence, something that listens back. Map of Hamadan. Deep in the old market of Hamadan, among stalls filled with the scent of spices and dried herbs, lies a small antique workshop. It was here that a map was once found that, at first glance, appeared to be an ordinary Persian scroll. The paper was yellow, stained with age, the lines thin and neat. But once unfolded, it became clear. This map shows places not found on any known terrestrial plane. The scroll depicts mountains, valleys, coastlines, and vast forests. But none of these shapes correspond to reality. Even the outlines of the continents appear different. In the center of the map is a huge island, divided into symbolic zones. Surrounding it is a chain of 6 lands, each marked with strange symbols reminiscent of a mixture of ancient drawings and patterns. Moreover, all the names are written in a clear, understandable Persian style, making the discovery even more mysterious. The first to notice the oddities was a young restorer. He noticed subtle lines beneath the main lines, as if the artist had attempted to conceal additional elements beneath the surface. When the restorer illuminated the map with a special lamp, a faint outline emerged, resembling a system of paths or directions. These lines seem to connect places that never existed. Some researchers believe the map may be symbolic, created for rituals or secret rites. However, the problem is that its precision is too great. Distances, proportions, land masses, everything is executed with incredible precision. Even the oceans are depicted as if the author had actually seen their contours. But if this is a reflection of reality, then reality was quite different from our world. There's a legend about a traveler who came to Hamadan many centuries ago, bringing with him a strange leather tube. He claimed to have found a map on a distant coast where a ruined city stood. This city, he claimed, was unknown to the Persians, Greeks, or any other people. People didn't believe him, but the tube fell into the hands of a merchant who carefully guarded it for the rest of his life. After that, all trace of the map was lost until it reappeared in an antique dealer's shop. But the most disturbing thing is the behavior of those who have studied the scroll for long periods. Several researchers admitted that after staring at the map for hours, they began to feel a strange sensation, as if the lines on it were slowly moving. They didn't change or disappear, but rather shifted by fractions of a millimeter. If you step away and look again, everything seemed to be in place. But one master swore he saw a small symbol in the corner of the map disappear, only to reappear a moment later on the other side. Some believe the map depicts not our world, but a reflection of it, a possible version that never became reality. Others are convinced that these are traces of ancient knowledge, lost in the mists of time. But among the locals, there's a quiet whisper. The Hamadan map is a path, not a signpost, but a map of what was here before the current lands emerged. One fragment is particularly disturbing, a circle in the center of the map, surrounded by a delicate ornament. It's empty, completely blank, as if the artist hadn't finished the work. But from a certain angle, it becomes apparent. Within the circle, there's a faint trace of a line, like a swirl. And those who have seen this trace say it only appears when one stares too long. The Hamadan map is still kept in a glass case in the same workshop. It's not given to museums or taken away for study. Locals believe it's best to leave the scroll where it is. Sometimes when the shop empties and the evening quiet sets in, a faint warmth seems to emanate from the glass case, as if the map isn't just an object of the past, but part of something that's still unfinished. Sunken Circle of Pura. In the highlands of Peru, among lakes hidden between cliffs, there's a place the locals call Pura. Its water is murky and cold, and its shores are strewn with rocks, as if some invisible giant had once shaken the mountains and scattered everything around. But the real secret lies beneath the surface. At the bottom of the lake lie perfect stone circles, even and precise, as if carved by a machine that never existed in these parts. The first stories about the circle came from fishermen who noticed a strange glow underwater at dawn. The light was faint, barely perceptible, but sufficient to discern a distinct geometric shape. As the sun rose, the glow faded, and with it the clarity of the image. The circles became dark and almost invisible. But in those brief moments before dawn, one thing was clear: the shape was too perfect to be natural. For a long time, locals believed the circles were part of an old legend about a people who lived in the mountains before the advent of known civilizations. These people supposedly knew how to talk to stone, not literally, but through a special method of working it. Stone yielded to their hands as easily as clay, and the Piura circles were considered one of the last vestiges of their vanished culture. However, the real mystery was revealed when researchers attempted to measure the lake's depth and study the circles with instruments. The equipment detected strange vibrations at the bottom, as if the stones were vibrating slightly. This wasn't a sign of noticeable movement, but rather an internal tension, subtle but stable. No geological theory could explain why a dead stone behaved as if something alive were inside it. One of the expeditions lowered a camera on a cable. Several circles, almost perfectly parallel to one another, were visible on the screen. The stones varied in size, but the overall pattern was the same: a thin line along the edge and a symbol resembling intersecting arcs in the center. But the strangest thing emerged later, when the researchers reviewed the footage. In the video, the circles were positioned differently than when the camera was lowered. At first, they thought they had made a mistake, but upon comparing the frames, they noticed that one of the circles seemed to have shifted several centimeters. The locals weren't surprised. They believe the circles in Piura aren't decorations or the remains of ancient structures, but rather signs. They say the circles watch those who approach the lake. If a visitor comes with pure intentions, the circles remain calm. But if a person brings anxiety or evil intentions, the water becomes murky and the circles seem to retreat, disappearing deeper. Such stories sound like superstition, but in the mountains, legends have been passed down for so long that they become part of reality. The most frightening incident occurred when a tourist attempted to swim above the circles to get a closer look. According to eyewitnesses, the water around him began to swirl, even though there was no wind. When pulled out, the tourist said he felt as if someone was pulling his legs from below. There are no whirlpools in the lake, but in the area where the circles are located, the water sometimes behaves strangely, as if it has a will of its own. Scientists have attempted to explain the underwater circles as either a trick of the light or an illusion caused by the properties of the water. But these explanations fail to explain the perfectly even geometry and symbols, which are completely alien to the known cultures of the region. Moreover, some researchers believe the circles are too well preserved, as if someone were periodically renewing them, or they were renewing themselves. There's another detail that many are afraid to discuss. At night, quiet sounds are sometimes heard near the water, not voices or rustling, but something akin to vibration. This sound is typical of electronic devices operating in the depths. However, no electronics have ever been found in Lake Piura. The sunken circle of Piura remains a mystery. Its origin is unknown, its behavior unpredictable. But everyone who has seen it at least once agrees. It's not just a stone structure, it's something waiting, and perhaps watching. Voices of Salmagor. In northwestern Spain, amid misty hills and old abandoned chapels, lies the tiny village of Salmagor. At first glance, it seems unremarkable: a few houses, narrow paths, and occasional lights in the evenings. But it is here that generations have told tales of a strange phenomenon: choirs resounding inside the old chapel, even though it's empty. The chapel stands on a hill, made of cracked stone, with a slanted roof. By day, it appears like an ordinary, forgotten building, but at night, everything changes. The inner darkness seems to come alive, and voices begin to be heard from within. They sound soft and drawn out, like an ancient church chant. But the main thing is the sense of polyphony, as if a large choir were standing inside, singing in several keys at once. The first mention of voices comes from shepherds. They claim to hear singing at dawn as they passed by with their flocks. But when they tried to enter, the sounds instantly ceased. Some managed to get very close, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, the chapel became completely silent. This silence was especially poignant after the deep, vibrant singing. Researchers visiting Salmigor attempted to understand the nature of the phenomenon. They offered various explanations: sound reflection from the valleys, wind passing through cracks, the sound of moving air. But even the most daring theories crumbled before one fact. The voices are always heard only at night, in complete silence, when the wind dies down and the air is still. Furthermore, the voices sound like real human voices, with breathing, melodic changes, and precise rhythm. Locals aren't afraid of the voices, but rather respect them. They believe they aren't the souls of the dead or ghosts, but rather memory of songs. Supposedly, a large choir once sang in this chapel, renowned throughout the surrounding lands. People believe these songs penetrated the stone so deeply that they remained there even after centuries. And now the stones return them in the silence of the night. However, there are even more disturbing stories. Some claim to have heard a distinct voice, distinct in timbre, amidst the general singing. It uttered barely audible words, as if trying to convey something important. But the sentence always trailed off, as if someone had turned off the sound. What's particularly strange is that people describe this voice in the same way. Soft, yet insistent, as if calling. One day, a group of researchers decided to record singing. They set up microphones near the chapel and waited for nightfall. When the voices emerged, the instruments indeed picked up the sounds. But when the recording was played back, everything was different. Instead of a melodic choir, the recording only contained barely audible noises, like crackling. However, those standing nearby at the time swore they had heard real voices. It turns out that the human ear hears one thing, while the equipment records another. One observation proved particularly puzzling. Several witnesses reported that during the singing, the light inside the chapel seemed to change. Although there are no candles or other light sources, a soft glow is sometimes visible in the window openings. Not a bright one, but rather like a reflection of the moon on a moving surface. However, the moon is at a different angle at these moments, so it's impossible to explain this as a reflection. Locals believe the voices appear only when a person is ready to hear something important. They are certain that each chant is slightly different from the last. Some say they heard a familiar, almost earthly melody. Others claim the singing sounded as if it were performed by a choir that doesn't exist in our world. These differences conceal another mystery. Why does everyone hear a different version? The Salmigor Chapel has stood on the hill for many centuries. It's decaying and crumbling, but the voices within it have not weakened. On the contrary, some claim the singing has become more intense in recent years, as if someone has added new voices to an invisible choir. And while scientists try to explain this by the wind or acoustics, the residents of Salmigor say the stone simply remembers. And sometimes it sings, "Heat Pillars of Namibia." In the heart of southwest Africa, amidst the endless red desert, there's a stretch of land locally known as the Road of Hot Shadows. During the day, it's indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape: sand, occasional rocks, dry air. But at night, phenomena occur here that defy our usual understanding of nature. It's during the hours of darkness that vertical columns of warm air appear above the ground, smooth, straight, like transparent columns within which space trembles. These pillars are barely visible to the eye, but they can be easily felt on the skin. You take a step and suddenly feel yourself entering a zone of soft warmth, while all around you lies the absolute coolness of the desert. The pillars stand motionless, like invisible beacons. But sometimes they begin to move, slowly, almost smoothly, as if following their own trajectory. They are unaffected by wind, temperature, or air movement. Their path is always unpredictable. The first tales of heat pillars come from tribes living on the edge of the desert. Elders claim that the pillars appeared even in the time of their ancestors and have always been considered a sign of change. They called them traces of beings, not gods or spirits, but those who pass between worlds. These beings are invisible to humans, but their path seems to leave a warm vortex in the night air. Some hunters believe that if you stand in a heat pillar for a long time, you can hear a barely audible sound, a low tremor like breathing. Scientists also tried to explain the phenomenon. They suggested it was a rare form of heat flow emanating from underground. But soil measurements showed that the temperature beneath the surface remained constant, meaning the heat source wasn't in the sand. Others believed it was a special play of cold and warm air occurring during sudden temperature changes. But the pillars appear even on nights with uniform temperatures. And they always disappear suddenly, without logic or pattern. The movement of these columns remains particularly mysterious. Sometimes they slowly float across the desert, avoiding obstacles. They don't pass through rocks or bushes, but seem to sense them in advance. One researcher reported observing a column of heat stop in front of a large boulder, wait a few moments, and then gently shift to the side, avoiding it. This behavior cannot be explained by natural currents. The strangest incident happened to a traveler who stopped for the night in the desert. He noticed a nearby column of heat moving toward him. At first, the man thought it was a mirage, but as it approached, he felt warmth. The column came so close that he found himself half embedded in it. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The surrounding sounds disappeared, the air became thick, and his movements became heavy. The traveler claimed to have seen a shadow standing inside the column. Then everything disappeared. Only the surrounding sand remained warm, as if someone had recently stood there. Locals don't deny such stories. They say the heat pillars aren't a threat, but they're not a blessing either. They're a sign that the desert is awakening. People believe the pillars appear where ancient paths run beneath the surface. Not roads in the earthly sense, but trails once used by vanished peoples or creatures few dare speak of. Some researchers have noticed another detail. When a column of heat passes near a person, the shadows behave strangely. They stretch, compress, and change direction, as if the light emanated not from the moon, but from the column itself. This phenomenon has been observed repeatedly, and no one has found an explanation for it. If the column were simply hot air, it would not be able to change the direction of the shadows. There are even bolder theories. Some believe the heat columns are thin rifts in space where two layers of the world meet. If you enter such a rift too deeply, you might see something not intended for human eyes. That's why the locals never get close. They respect the desert and its mysteries. Namibia's heat columns remain a mystery. They cause no harm, leave no trace, and are unmeasurable. But everyone who has seen them at least once agrees. They're not just air. They're like the footsteps of invisible travelers moving through the desert, leaving behind warm trails that vanish as suddenly as they appear. Forest of the Shadow Passage. Deep in the Canadian forests, among tall pines and smooth carpets of moss, there's a stretch of land that travelers avoid. It's called the Shadow Passage Forest. It's quiet during the day. The wind gently sways the branches, birds sing, and dry pine needles crunch underfoot. But as soon as you take a few steps deeper, you notice something strange. The shadows no longer obey the light. They have a life of their own. The first peculiarity becomes noticeable at the edge of the forest. The sun shines from the left, but a tree's shadow suddenly falls to the right. Or vice versa. The light is from the side, but the shadow somehow lies in front of you. Most people attribute this to an optical illusion, but the further you go, the more pronounced the phenomenon becomes. The shadows shift smoothly, sometimes almost imperceptibly, but never correspond to the actual position of the sun. They seem to respond to footsteps, not to the light. A hunter once reported noticing the following. The shadow of his own body first appeared behind him, then slowly crept forward, as if trying to escape its master. As the shadow passed the nearest tree, it didn't merge with his shadow, but passed over it as if it were a separate entity. The hunter ran back to the old path and never returned. There are other stories too. Travelers claim that shadows sometimes gather in one place, not chaotically, but as if drawn to one another. A dense, dark spot appears on the ground, one that shouldn't exist in bright daylight. It lies motionless until someone approaches. Then the spot begins to spread, scattering across the ground as if disturbed. What's most frightening is that shadows sometimes lag behind actual movements. You can raise your hand, and the shadow will only repeat the gesture a couple of seconds later. Or, conversely, the shadow changes position slightly before the person has time to move. These delays are sometimes so subtle that they can be mistaken for a visual error. But people who have been in the forest assure us that if you look closely, it becomes clear that this is not an optical illusion. Shadows truly live according to their own rhythm. Scientists have attempted to explain the phenomenon by lighting peculiarities, complex reflections, or unusual atmospheric conditions, but none have worked. The forest lacks natural mirror surfaces and no mineral deposits capable of reflecting light in unusual ways. Moreover, the phenomenon can be observed in any weather, on a clear day, under cloud cover, even in light fog. Some researchers have suggested that the shadows are the result of an optical trap created by the intertwining branches. But this doesn't explain the odd delays in movement and independent direction. Local residents are convinced that the forest doesn't want to be disturbed, and the shadows are a way to remind people of its boundaries. One of the most frightening incidents involved a group of tourists who decided to spend the night near a forest. They set up camp nearby and noticed that the shadows cast by the fire were behaving strangely. Instead of flickering away from the light source, the shadows stretched toward the completely dark side. The tourists reported seeing the shadows cast by their tents slowly stretching into the forest, as if someone was calling them inside. There's a legend about an old guide who knew the paths of the shadow passage better than anyone else. He claimed that the shadows in the forest weren't distortions of light, but traces of those who had passed on. According to him, there was once a settlement in these parts, whose inhabitants disappeared under strange circumstances. Their bodies were never found, but their shadows remained, living on. Not ghosts or souls, simply imprints forgotten by the world. The guide said shadows could reveal a person's own fears. If a person enters the forest restless, their shadow will move jerkily, as if trembling. If they are calm, the shadow will become smooth. But there is one rule: never step on someone else's shadow. It was believed that doing so could cause the person's shadow to become confused with another trace and cease to be their own. Some researchers have recorded weak fluctuations in light outside the visible spectrum, but they couldn't explain why these fluctuations only affect shadows and not surrounding objects, or why shadows react to humans and not the surrounding environment. The strangest thing about the forest is that shadows sometimes disappear completely. You walk, but no shadow appears, either in front or behind. This lasts a few seconds, but it's the most frightening sensation of all. It's as if the forest momentarily takes your shadow for itself. The Forest of Shadow Passage remains one of Canada's most inexplicable phenomena, and everyone who emerges from it says the same thing. In this place, light is not master. Shadows rule, and sometimes they act as if they are watching a person's every move. The noisy cross of Gelmir. In northern Norway, amidst cold plains and low gray hills, stands a wooden cross known locally as Helmer's Cross. It's old, moss-covered, and warped with age. It seems like an ordinary sign, like many found along old trails. But this cross has a peculiarity. It emits a low hum, like a drawn-out vibrating sound. And it does this only when a person approaches. The hum begins unexpectedly, quietly at first, almost inaudible. But if you stand there for a few seconds, it grows louder, as if something inside the tree is awakening. People describe the sound as deep, rich, like the vibration of a metal wire under high tension. But the cross is made of wood, old and fragile. There is nothing metallic about it. Locals are convinced the cross hears footsteps. They say that as soon as a person approaches, the tree seems to react, emitting an initial wave of humming. If one moves away, the sound gradually fades until it disappears completely. Sometimes the hum lasts a few seconds, sometimes almost a minute, but it never starts on its own, only in the presence of a person. There's an old legend that the cross was erected by a monk who wandered the northern lands many centuries ago. He chose this spot because he heard voices of the earth there, his term for deep, barely perceptible sounds. According to the stories, the monk recorded the rustling of these voices in his notes, attempting to understand their meaning. But one day he disappeared, and a cross appeared in the spot where he was last seen. No one knows whether it was placed there by people or whether it arose of its own accord. Scientists tried to figure out the source of the sound. They believed the hum could be related to wind movement through the pores of the tree. But the cross resonates even in complete silence when the air is still. Others suggested a soil resonance. But measurements showed that the ground beneath the cross was stable, without vibrations. Then they proposed the theory of hidden channels in the tree trunk, but the cross was hand-carved from a single piece. The strangest aspect concerns the direction of the hum. Sometimes it travels up the trunk, sometimes down. Sometimes the sound seems to circle around the crossbar, as if circling the cross. One researcher thought he heard a faint echo of his own breathing, but with a delay. It was as if the tree wasn't simply humming, but imitating the surrounding sounds, transforming them into vibrations. Several travelers claimed that the cross trembled slightly during the humming. The trembling was weak, almost imperceptible, but distinctly felt if you placed your palm against the wood. This behavior is unlike normal natural physical reactions. In a cold and dry climate, the wood should have long since died, but the cross seemed to retain warmth within. There's another detail that's rarely discussed. Several witnesses admitted hearing not just a sound in the roar, but a faint rhythm. Not constant, but reminiscent of a heartbeat, deep and infrequent. These people claimed the rhythm matched their own pulse only for the first few seconds, and then took on a life of its own, speeding up or slowing down. It was as if the cross created its own rhythm, independent of the individual. Locals treat Gelmir's cross with cautious respect. They say the tree isn't just an object, but a listener. It seems to absorb the sounds of the earth, people, and the wind, returning them as a hum when someone approaches. They don't consider the cross dangerous, but they are certain it guards something that must not be disturbed. The most disturbing story involves a traveler who decided to spend the night nearby. During the night, he was awakened by a loud hum. The cross was so loud that the vibrations could be felt on the ground. The man approached and saw the tree swaying slightly. There was complete silence all around, no wind, no animal sounds. He fled and never returned. Helmira's cross has stood in the same place for generations. It hasn't been moved, repaired, or replaced. People are certain that if it were touched, not only would the sound disappear, but something vital that maintains the balance of these lands would disappear. And as dawn breaks over the northern plains, the cross continues to hum, softly, subduedly, as if from the depths of its ancient memory. Nirmala crystals. In the mountains of northern India, there's a small valley where shepherds sometimes find strange stones. They call them Nirmala crystals. At first glance, they appear to be ordinary gemstones, transparent with a slight milky tint. But hold one in your hands for even a minute, and patterns begin to appear within. Fine lines resembling cracks or veins slowly grow, intertwine, and change shape. When you place the stone back on the ground, the patterns fade. But if you pick it up again, they continue to grow. One shepherd told of finding a crystal the size of a walnut and bringing it home. That evening, he noticed a thin line, like a thread within the stone. By morning, this line had already broken into several branches, and a couple of days later, it had formed a pattern resembling a tree leaf. The man thought it was simply an optical effect, But when he showed the crystal to a neighbor, the pattern changed. One branch disappeared, and another grew longer. It was as if the stone was reacting not only to time, but also to people. Some researchers, hearing about these stories, decided to study the phenomenon. They discovered that the patterns inside the crystals do indeed change, not on the surface, but within the structure itself. This change is not related to heat, moisture, or pressure. Rather, the patterns grow as if a slow, living process were taking place within the stone. Yet the crystal remains solid, showing no signs of softening. The strangest observation is that each crystal has its own character. Some change patterns slowly, almost imperceptibly. Others change rapidly, as if rushing to complete an intricate design. Some form cycles. The patterns reach a certain shape, then disappear, and everything begins again. Locals say that each stone remembers the person who held it. If you hold a crystal in your hands long enough, the patterns begin to emphasize certain shapes, resembling silhouettes. But these details always remain unclear. There's a legend about a woman named Nirmala who lived in these parts many generations ago. She collected medicinal herbs and stones, and one day she found a gemstone with a dark line inside it, resembling a road. Legend has it that she followed this sign and disappeared into the mountains. People searched for her for a long time, but found only a crystal lying on a rock. Inside, there was a different design, like a closed door. Since then, the stones have been called Nirmala crystals. Some researchers attempt to explain the phenomenon by the growth of naturally occurring microcracks. But these cracks shouldn't change shape so quickly or respond so strongly to touch. Furthermore, some patterns are too complex to be random. They resemble maps, symbols, or even movements. One geologist student reported seeing a shape resembling a human profile in the crystal. After a few days, the profile disappeared, giving way to a branching structure resembling roots. There are also more disturbing observations. Several people claimed that the crystal began to change patterns more quickly when kept in the dark. The lines inside the stone moved as if alive, creating the sensation that the crystal was showing something. Sometimes this happened even in a closed box. One woman swore she heard a soft squeak when she held the stone to her ear, though others heard nothing. But the most mysterious thing remains that some patterns repeat from crystal to crystal. They appear over the years as if the stones were linked together. These repeating patterns are called signs. Their shapes resemble intertwined arcs, sometimes circles, and sometimes an obscure symbol. Locals are certain that if they collect enough crystals, they can piece together a whole story from these signs. But no one has yet collected enough of them. Travelers say the valley where Nirmala crystals are found has a peculiar silence. It's as if the air there is holding something back, something that refuses to fully open. And if you stare at the stones for too long, you get the feeling the patterns are watching you back. Nirmala crystals remain one of the quietest and most enigmatic mysteries of the Indian mountains. They emit no light, move, or make any sound. But anyone who has held one feels the same thing. There is something alive within the crystal, or something very much like life. Montaldo's fire spirals. In northern Italy, in a hilly region near the ancient village of Montaldo, there's a place locals call the Field of Fire Trails. During the day, it appears peaceful, soft grass, sparse bushes, gentle slopes. But several times a year, a phenomenon difficult to explain appears over this field. Glowing spirals appear in the dark sky, resembling slowly rotating rings of fire. The spirals appear suddenly, without thunder, without flashes, without warning. At first, a dim circle is visible in the sky, like a smoky trail. But after a few seconds, it begins to glow, growing brighter, as if someone were lighting a candle inside a ring. Then the circle begins to rotate. The movement is always slow, smooth, almost mesmerizing. Sometimes a second spiral appears, repeating the movement of the first, but in the opposite direction. They don't collide, but seem to dance around each other. Local residents say their great-grandfathers observed these fiery spirals. Back then, people believed they were a sign that the souls of those who died too soon were passing over the earth. Now, residents are more cautious about talking about such things, but many remain convinced that the appearance of the spirals is never a coincidence. Some have noticed that the phenomenon occurs more often before important events in the village: the birth of a child, the death of an elder, or a change in the weather. Scientists have attempted to investigate the phenomenon several times. They assumed it was a rare form of glow caused by shifting air masses. However, the fiery spirals appear on calm, quiet nights when there is no wind. Another theory is an unusual distortion of light caused by particles in the air. But the spirals are so bright and stable that this explanation seems too simple, and most importantly, no atmospheric phenomena can create near-perfect spiral structures that rotate independently of air currents. One researcher reported seeing a spiral several hundred meters away. He claimed the inner part of the circle was empty, but a thin line of light, like a burning thread, moved along its edge. At some point, this thread split into several lines that began rotating around each other. He claimed to hear a quiet, barely perceptible sound, a low hum, as if the spiral were vibrating. There are even more frightening stories. Several residents said the spiral once sank below its usual level. That night it was seen not only above the field, but also near the hill, almost at treetop level. One shepherd swore he saw a shadow inside the spiral, a vague silhouette moving within the circle, as if walking along an invisible path. However, the grass beneath the circle did not burn or glow. After the spiral disappeared, not a trace remained on the ground. Nights when several spirals appear at once are considered particularly strange. They then form a pattern resembling a drawing. These patterns never repeat exactly, but locals believe they have meaning. Elder Montaldo said the pattern resembles ancient symbols he saw on fragments of ancient stone slabs. He claimed these slabs belonged to a vanished people who, according to legend, knew how to set the air on fire. Some travelers who witnessed the phenomenon with their own eyes noted a distortion of time during the appearance of the spirals. Some said the phenomenon lasted only a few minutes, while others claimed it lasted almost half an hour. This sensation creates a strange atmosphere, as if the fiery spirals were not simply visible light, but an intrusion into space itself. Sometimes the spirals disappear instantly, as if someone turned off the light. Other times they slowly dissolve, leaving behind a faint trace, like a misty haze. But as soon as the moon appears, the trace vanishes completely. Montaldo's fiery spirals remain a mystery. They cause no harm, are not destructive to nature, and create no noise. But everyone who has seen them at least once agrees. It doesn't resemble either a natural phenomenon or a trick of light. The spirals appear as if something living, yet invisible, is moving across the sky, leaving a luminous trail behind. And if you look closely at this dance of fire, you get the feeling that it repeats not by chance, but according to some ancient, almost forgotten law. Phantom Sahara Caravan. Deep in the desert, where the horizons tremble in the heat and dunes stretch for days on end, there is a place the nomads call the Road of Vanishing Shadows. Here, on the desert plain, people have observed the same phenomenon for generations, a night caravan of silhouettes, clearly visible but impossible to catch. They call it the Phantom Caravan. It appears suddenly, moves across the sand in a neat line, and disappears as silently as it came. The first thing witnesses notice is the trembling outlines of the camels. The silhouettes are large, dark, sometimes with long shadows that sway in time with their steps. But the closer a person tries to get, the further the caravan retreats. The distance seems to remain constant. You can walk for hours, but the figures remain at the same distance, close enough to see, but too far to touch. Nomads are certain that the caravan isn't a vision looming on the brink of fatigue. It appears even to well-rested travelers, to experienced travelers, to groups of people who see the same thing simultaneously. Moreover, the phantom caravan moves strictly along an ancient trade route that's been around for centuries. This route has long been abandoned, but the caravan continues to travel it, as if time stood still. What's particularly disturbing is that the caravan's figures are always identical. The same order: a few camels in front, shadows of people nearby, a long line of silhouettes at the end. They don't change formation, don't waver, don't merge. Equally surprising is that their footsteps don't stir up sand. It's quiet all around, even when the caravan passes almost alongside. There's no rustling, no breathing of animals, no characteristic clanking of equipment. Only smooth, even silhouettes moving forward. Some researchers considered this a rare type of mirage. However, mirages occur in hot weather, while phantom caravans most often appear at night, in cooler weather, when the air is dense and still. Mirages disappear when the viewing angle changes, but the caravan can be observed for a long time until it dissolves on its own. They appear not as a reflection of light, but as shadows with their own purpose. There's also a frightening legend. Long ago, long before the modern tribes appeared, a huge trade caravan passed through the desert. It was led by a merchant who, they say, was attempting to smuggle goods through a forbidden valley where others did not go. People said he was confident of a successful journey, but the caravan never returned. After several moons, the nomads found only the glow of fires and deep tracks leading off into a place where there were no paths or water. A little later, phantom silhouettes began to appear. Locals believe this is the very same caravan that never found its way back. Some travelers claim to hear barely perceptible sounds when the phantom caravan passed closer than usual. These weren't voices or footsteps, but a light, low hum, as if sand were vibrating. One man said he felt the ground beneath his feet shake, even though there was complete silence all around. He is certain that the caravan leaves behind a trail not physically, but energetically, as if passing through a layer that people don't usually perceive. Sometimes the caravan disappears, not in a distant haze, but immediately, as if it had been turned off. Blink, and the silhouettes are gone. But there are never any footprints left in the sand. Even in the morning, before the wind has yet swept across the dunes, the sand remains untouched, as if the caravan had never really been there. And yet, dozens of people saw it with their own eyes. Moonless nights are considered especially mysterious. In such darkness, you can't even see your own footprints, but the phantom caravan appears brightly, as if lit from within. The silhouettes don't glow, but they seem to be illuminated by a different light, one not present in the surrounding world. This spectacle is both mesmerizing and terrifying, creating the feeling that the caravan is traveling along a road people have forgotten, yet one that still exists. The Sahara's phantom caravan remains one of the desert's most silent mysteries. It neither attacks nor harms, but leaves one with the feeling of having witnessed something long gone and still trying to find its way. And when the shadows dissolve into the sand again, it seems as if the desert has momentarily revealed its ancient, hidden world, and then immediately closed it back. Okekana Library. In eastern China, among hills shrouded in mist and ancient pine trees, there's a place known only to local elders. They call it the Okekana Library, though there are no books there. These underground chambers are carved into the rock so skillfully that it seems as if the stone was once as soft as clay. Inside the chambers stand slabs resembling the pages of a gigantic book. Each slab is covered with lines resembling text, but this text is illegible. The entrance to the library is hidden behind stone ledges. To get inside, you need to know the path precisely, otherwise it's easy to miss it. As you descend, the air becomes colder, and the silence thickens. At the bottom, the first gallery opens, long, straight, with walls receding into darkness. Along it stand slabs as tall as a man. At first glance, they appear to be carved with symbols, but upon closer inspection, the lines are smooth, as if they had been drawn out of the stone rather than carved. The most bizarre feature of the slabs is their ability to change their pattern. A traveler once photographed a slab and noticed that the pattern looked different in the evening than it did in the morning. The difference was subtle, but real. Some lines had disappeared, and new curves had appeared. Locals say the slabs rewrite themselves when you're not looking. But the moment you approach again, the pattern freezes, as if the stone refuses to reveal its secret to a direct gaze. Some people think the lines on the slabs resemble a map. Long straight lines, sharp transitions, connections resembling ridges and valleys. But if you compare these lines with real maps, there are no matches. Sometimes, however, the drawing resembles a traffic pattern, like a route leading through mountains that don't exist in our world. Researchers have tried to match the patterns with ancient routes, but not a single one has matched what is depicted on the slabs. The most daring theories suggest that the Oak Kaina Library was created not as a place to store texts, but as a means of transmitting knowledge. Perhaps the slabs were a kind of instrument through which one could read not with the eyes, but with the senses. Elders say that there were once people who could understand patterns without words, feeling the meaning through their palms or their breath. But such people are long gone. There's a story told by an old guide who claimed to have heard a faint rustling sound in the library. It sounded like someone turning the pages of stone. The sound was quiet, unusual, not a crack or creak, but rather the hum of movement, as if the stone had a life of its own. But when the guide approached, the rustling disappeared. In its place there was absolute silence, so thick it seemed the air had grown heavier. The library's main hall is particularly disturbing. It's enormous, with vaulted ceilings receding into darkness. In the center of the hall stands a round slab, unmarked by a single line. It's perfectly smooth, as if it were made yesterday. Locals believe this slab is the library's 0 page. Some claim that if you stand in front of it long enough, a faint movement appears on the surface, a misty, barely visible wave. People who have witnessed this have said they felt as if the slab were trying to remember something. There are even more frightening stories. Several travelers claim to have seen a shadow in the depths of the hall that didn't belong to any person. The shadow moved slowly, as if reading the slabs. But as soon as they blinked, the shadow disappeared. There was no fire or light in the hall. Where the shadow could have come from remains a mystery. Scientists who have visited the site admit that the library's construction cannot be explained by conventional tools. The stone appears to have been cut not with a blade, but with something smooth that separated the rock without effort. Even with modern equipment, it is difficult to replicate such a surface. The Oak Kaina Library remains a place spoken of in whispers. There's no threat here, no traps, but there's a sense that these halls weren't created for the people of our time, as if someone left knowledge here that we don't yet understand. And while the stone pages continue to shift their patterns, it seems as if the library is waiting for someone who can finally read it. Singing Algae of Hokkaido. On the northern coast of the Japanese island of Hokkaido, there's a bay that remains deserted for most of the year. It's called Sheo Bay. The water there is cold and clear, and the bottom is covered with thick mats of seaweed. During the day, they look ordinary, soft, dark, swaying in time with the waves. But at night, especially when there's no wind, the seaweed begins to emit sounds. These sounds resemble the soft melodies of flutes. Travelers first noticed the phenomenon many years ago. Fishermen returning from fishing would hear strange, drawn-out notes emanating from the water. They didn't sound like birdsong, the wind, or the lapping of waves. Rather, it was a soft, clear sound, as if someone were drawing a thin glass rod along the rim of a bowl. Over time, people began to notice that the melody changed depending on the movement of the water. Sometimes the sounds were isolated, sometimes they would form a short sequence, reminiscent of real music. Scientists suspected that the sound might be caused by air bubbles trapped in the seaweed, but the sound is too clear without the hissing or popping sounds typical of bubbles. You can run your hand over the seaweed, no sound is heard. But move away, leaving it in the stillness of the night, and the melody begins to return. Moreover, the sounds are only audible above water. Underwater, there is absolute silence. One diver described being underwater in a bay when he heard a melody above. He couldn't hear a note underwater, but he could see the seaweed vibrating slightly. It wasn't moved by the pressure of the waves, but rather by an internal pulsation. The diver said he felt as if the seaweed were trying to transmit something upward, as if the sound were intended only for the surface. Some locals believe the seaweed doesn't sing on its own. They believe the sound is a reflection of energy moving along the shoreline. They say the bay stands on the site of ancient sailor rituals. People believe the water heard and responded. Perhaps the seaweed has become a kind of conductor between the water and the air. But there are even more mysterious tales. Several fishermen claim to hear a melody similar to the tune their ancestors played on ancient flutes. They couldn't explain the similarity, but said the melody created the feeling of someone nearby, even though they were standing alone on the shore. Particularly sensitive individuals claimed that the seaweed sang differently to different listeners. To one, it produced soft, drawn-out notes. To another, sharper, barely perceptible ones. One researcher decided to spend the night by the bay with a microphone. He recorded sounds for several hours. When he listened to the recording, he was astonished. The melody was completely different from what he had heard in person, much deeper, louder, and more complex. High notes intertwined with low ones, creating a structure reminiscent of an ancient chant. But the strangest thing is that the recording was made from the same place where he was standing. Why the ear hears one thing and the instrument hears another remains a mystery. As mid-autumn approaches, the voices become stronger. On the quietest nights, the melodies are so clear as if someone is playing an invisible instrument just beneath the surface. Sometimes you can hear the sound disintegrating into several lines radiating outward, as if the algae were conducting a quiet, invisible dialogue among themselves. There's a theory that the algae react to moonlight. People have noticed, the brighter the moon, the softer the melody. And at night, when the moon is hidden by clouds, the sounds become more alarming, sharper, like a warning. But there's no scientific evidence for this, only observations. The most mysterious detail emerges in winter. When the water is covered with a layer of ice, the sounds disappear. But as soon as the ice melts, the melody returns with the first wave, as if the algae were silent, only because their voices were trapped beneath the ice. Locals whisper that at these moments the bay breathes and sings. Hokkaido's singing seaweed remains one of the most beautiful yet inexplicable mysteries of the northern seas. They cause no harm, pose no threat, but everyone who has heard their nocturnal melodies says the same thing. It doesn't sound like nature. It sounds like a message, and it's always addressed to those willing to listen. Rain of glass dust. In northwestern Argentina, amidst dry plateaus and rocky outcrops, there's a place that residents of nearby villages avoid unless absolutely necessary. They call it the Valley of the Glass Breath. Every few years, a phenomenon difficult to describe occurs over this valley. A fine, sparkling dust begins to fall from the sky, resembling glass grains, glittering even in dim light. The first reports of such rain appeared long ago, when shepherds noticed the ground after a nighttime storm covered in tiny, shiny grains. They were so small that they were easily blown away by the wind, yet they retained their shape, as if made of a fragile mineral. The shepherds collected them in their palms, held them up to the sun, and reported that the dust shimmered in every hue, from blue to gold. The main oddity is that the glass dust rain appears only in clear weather. No clouds, no wind, no moisture. The sky is calm and the air is still. And then, suddenly, tiny shining grains begin to fall, unlike sand, snow, or ash. The dust doesn't scratch the skin, but leaves a slight tingling sensation, as if something cool were touching the surface of the body. Scientists attempted to collect glass dust for analysis. However, the samples proved too unstable. After a few hours, they lost their luster, became dull, and turned into ordinary gray grains, resembling fine dust. When examined under magnification, they appeared as irregular fragments, like broken particles of some fragile substance. But the origin of these particles remains unclear. It's believed the dust may be the result of rare atmospheric phenomena, for example, the collision of ice crystals at altitude, which evaporate, leaving behind minerals. But such processes should leave traces of moisture or temperature changes. Here, however, nothing changes. The rain falls quietly, steadily, and stops as suddenly as it began. Sometimes it lasts only a few minutes, sometimes almost an hour. More disturbing stories come from those who have been caught in such rain repeatedly. They've noticed that the glass dust sometimes seems to form patterns on the ground. The grains aren't laid randomly, but in thin, labyrinth-like lines. These lines disintegrate after a couple of hours, but everyone who has witnessed them in person claims the patterns are too precise to be random. They resemble ancient symbols, laid out by an invisible artist. A resident of a nearby village recounted hearing a barely perceptible ringing sound one night, like the soft tinkling of glass. He stepped outside and saw a faint cloud glowing over the valley, like a thin haze with something glowing within it. A few minutes later, a dust rain began. There was no wind. The cloud hung motionless in the air, as if held by an invisible force. Some travelers reported that during glass rain the air becomes denser. Breathing seems unusual, slightly viscous. Hearing changes, sounds become muffled, as if it weren't rain that was passing, but a thin curtain between the person and the world. One man claimed to have seen a shadow flicker through this curtain, thin, like a human silhouette, but moving faster than anyone could follow. There's an old legend from a Native American tribe that once lived here. It says that the glass dust is the breath of the celestial animals, creatures that move across the sky at night. When they pass too low, their breath settles on the ground. The people in the legend believed these creatures carried knowledge. That's why the patterns on the ground were considered signs left specifically for those who could read. Scientists respect the ancient legends, but they admit the glass dust is unlike any natural formation in the region. It's too pure, too perfect, and behaves too strangely after falling. It vanishes quickly, as if composed of a substance that couldn't exist under normal conditions. Glass dust rain remains a mystery in Argentina. It's beautiful, mesmerizing, but it brings with it the feeling of observing a phenomenon from another world. And each time the dust disappears, it seems to take with it some piece of the mystery, leaving only a sparkle in the memories of those who witnessed it. White Towers of Maritsa. In Bulgaria, amid dense forests and rocky hills, there's a valley locals call Maritsa. Strange structures stand here, tall, narrow, seemingly elongated stone columns. They resemble towers, though they have no rooms, stairs, or passages inside. The towers' surfaces are perfectly smooth, whitish, as if coated with a thin layer of lime. And the most astonishing thing is that these towers tremble when one gets too close. The first stories about the towers came from shepherds. They noticed that when their flocks passed by, the towers seemed to respond, vibrating barely noticeably. The vibration was faint, but noticeable enough to cause alarm. The shepherds felt this tremor in their feet, as if the earth were transmitting it upward. But as soon as they moved away, the towers quieted down, becoming motionless and silent again. The nearest tower rises several times the height of a man. Its base is broad but gradually tapers toward the top. The lines are vertical and even, as if smoothed by the hand of a master. However, no one knows by whom or when they were created. There are no cut marks on the surface, no scratches, no gouges. The stone appears solid, as if it was not hewn but pulled from the earth. The most bizarre feature of the towers is their reaction to their presence. One researcher, getting close, placed his palm against the surface. The stone was cold, but beneath his fingers he felt a subtle, rhythmic pulsation. Not like a heartbeat, but more like a faint vibration, reminiscent of the measured echo of a distant mechanism. The scientists described the sensation as something breathing inside the tower. Some residents believe the towers are the remains of an ancient sanctuary. They speculate that rituals related to the earth were performed here centuries ago. Perhaps the towers served as conductors, amplifying vibrations in the soil or sounds. But if this is true, it leaves no explanation for how people managed to create such smooth, monolithic structures in ancient times. At dawn, one of the towers sometimes emits a faint glow. It's not bright, but soft, like the light of a misty sun. Sometimes the glow is absent, sometimes it lasts only a minute. But those who have seen it say the tower's surface seems to come alive, shimmering in even stripes from bottom to top. Scientists have tried to explain this by the reflection of light on wet stone, but even in dry weather, the glow persists. There's a disturbing story about a geologist who decided to take nighttime measurements. He set up instruments around the tower and retreated to his tent. During his observations, the tower began to shake so violently that the ground beneath his feet vibrated slightly. The instruments registered an unusual vibration. The frequency was too smooth, too precise, as if it were generated by a mechanism rather than a natural phenomenon. But when the geologist approached, the vibration ceased and the instruments detected nothing unusual. What's particularly eerie is that on some nights the towers emit a quiet hum. The sound is low, almost imperceptible. It resembles a deep sigh or the rustle of a large stone slowly shifting within itself. But not a single crack or line on the surface indicates that the towers are changing or moving. Only people standing nearby can hear the sound. Microphones don't pick it up. There's a legend about a man who once decided to climb one of the towers. He only got halfway up when he felt a strange sensation. The tower seemed to be tilting slightly, following his movements. He became frightened, descended, and a moment later, the tower became motionless again. Since then, no one has attempted this feat. Some researchers have noticed that the towers are arranged in an unusual pattern. They are not randomly positioned, but form a pattern reminiscent of a constellation. The lines between the towers align with the arrangement of stars in an ancient celestial pattern. Viewed from above, the shape seems too precise to be a coincidence. But who could have built such structures with the starry sky in mind? There's another detail that makes the towers particularly mysterious. Sometimes, in foggy weather, faint shadows can be seen between them. They move slowly, as if gliding along the ground. The shadows don't resemble either humans or animals. They're elongated, thin, and disappear as soon as they get close to people. Some believe they're reflections of the towers, but the direction of the light at such times makes this explanation impossible. The White Towers of Maritza remain a mystery. They remain silent, revealing no origin, but they respond to footsteps, breathing, and presence. And everyone who has stood near them at night says the same thing. The towers seem to be listening, as if waiting for the moment when man will finally understand why they stand in this valley. Shadows of Valdres. In western Iceland, where cliffs rise above the sea and the mists seem to have a life of their own, there's a small village called Valdres. There are just a few houses, the occasional fishing boat at the pier, and the constant rustle of the wind that penetrates even the closed shutters. The place is harsh and cold, but there's something about it that sets Valdres apart from hundreds of similar settlements. These are shadows that don't belong to people, animals, or any known objects. They're called the shadows of Valdres, and those who have seen them never forget. At first, everything seems normal. The sun is low, clouds lie in sparse stripes above the horizon, and shadows fall on the ground just as they do everywhere else. But as soon as a person approaches the cliffs that loom over the village, everything changes. In this place, the shadows seem to take on a life of their own. They can appear where no one is standing. They can follow a person's movements, but with a delay. and sometimes they don't correspond at all to the one casting them. The fishermen were the first to notice the strangeness. They said that many years ago, when they were returning home along a narrow path along the cliffs, they noticed extra shadows. It was a common sight: 2 fishermen in front, long shadows on the rock behind them. But when fog sets in, or when the sun sets behind the gray pines, a third shadow appears next to them, elongated, thin, as if belonging to someone who isn't there. It moves slowly, and when you turn around, it disappears. Some have tried to explain it away as a trick of the light, the peculiarities of the rocks, or reflections off the glistening sea surface. But the villagers are certain it's not the light. They say the shadows of Valdres appear even at night when there are no bright light sources. Then, on the ground, near the houses, one can see vague, human-like silhouettes. They move slowly, as if gliding along the walls, and if you look directly, they disappear. These shadows are especially common in autumn. The wind becomes steady and cold, and fog appears almost daily. People say shadows love fog. In it, they become more visible, thin streaks of dense darkness that move as if searching for something. The shadows never come too close, but they never leave completely either. They follow a person from a distance, posing no threat but conveying a sense of presence. An old man named Halvard recounted how he woke up one night with a strange sensation, as if someone was in the room. He stood up, went to the window, and saw a shadow on the wall next to him. The shadow looked human-like, but was elongated beyond belief, as if the light were falling at an impossible angle. But there was no candle or lamp in the room. The only source of light was the faint glow of the moon outside. Halvard claimed the shadow stood motionless, as if looking at him. It only disappeared when he took a step forward. Many villagers avoid talking about the shadows. They believe that discussing them out loud is drawing attention. There's a belief that the shadows of Valdres aren't reflections of anything, but rather imprints of what was here before. People believe there was once a settlement on this site, destroyed by a powerful storm. All the inhabitants perished in a single day. The sea swallowed the houses, the waves tore off the roofs, and the people disappeared into the dark water. The shadows, the elders say, are the traces of those who haven't completely left. Scientists once expressed interest in the phenomenon. Several researchers visited the village, setting up instruments to measure light and atmospheric conditions. They studied light reflections off rocks, water movement, and humidity patterns. But they were unable to explain the shadows that appeared without light, vanished before their eyes, and moved in the darkness. One group of researchers recorded a video near the rocks. A faint silhouette, resembling a shadow, was visible in the recording, although no one was near the camera at the time. However, the image quality was too poor to prove anything definitive. Another strange detail is that the shadows are never the same. Each time, the silhouettes are different. One is tall and narrow, another is stocky, a third seems childish. Sometimes the shadows move in sync with the person, but differ in shape. For example, a woman walking along a path and her shadow looks like a man's. Or conversely, the shadow moves faster than its source. Such cases raise profound doubts in people. Who is really casting this shadow? A fisherman recounted how one morning he noticed his own shadow detaching itself from him. It happened as he stood at the edge of the pier looking out to sea. His shadow lay on the rocks, elongated and even. But suddenly it seemed to blur, darken, and thicken. And a few seconds later, the fisherman claimed the shadow slowly moved toward the rocks, separated from him. He became frightened, ran home, and never went there alone again. There are even more frightening stories. Some people claim that shadows watch, not with their eyes, of course, but with their position. You can stand with your back to a cliff and notice a shadow appear nearby, its position out of sync with yours. It seems to turn toward you, as if watching. Sometimes people hear a slight rustling behind them, but when they turn around, there's no one there. Only fog, rocks, and a strange feeling that in this place the presence of the invisible becomes almost palpable. Some researchers attempt to link the phenomenon to psychological effects, fatigue, fear, and exposure to natural conditions. But such explanations ignore the facts. Shadows are seen by groups of people simultaneously. Shadows appear in the absence of light, and shadows move contrary to the laws of physics. The most astonishing manifestation of Valdres's shadows occurs during storms. When the wind becomes strong and the waves rise high, the shadows appear more frequently and in greater numbers. They move faster than usual, even crossing each other, as if in a hurry. People believe this is because places lost to the sea are resurfacing. The elements awaken what was in the past. There's an ancient belief: if Valdres's shadow touches a person's shadow, they will begin to see things that aren't there. Several residents reported feeling a presence nearby after such an event, even when they were alone. Some saw vague silhouettes in the periphery of their vision. Others heard faint footsteps behind them. This feeling fades after a few days, but leaves behind a deep sense of uneasiness. The shadows of Valdres remain one of Iceland's strangest and least understood mysteries. They cause no harm, but they leave a feeling as if the world here has become thinner, as if the boundary between what was and what is now has become transparent, and sometimes things that shouldn't be visible appear through it. And everyone who has stood on the path to the rocks and seen the extra shadow says the same thing. It's no accident. It's as if it knows it's been noticed, and it's waiting for the next step. Lake flashes of Turval. In northern Finland, amidst cold forests and watery valleys, there's a lake locally known as Turval. During the day, it appears ordinary. Calm, dark waters, and shores overgrown with moss and dwarf pines. But as night falls, the lake transforms into one of the strangest places in northern Europe. Flashes of cold blue light appear on its surface, like the reflection of distant lightning hidden beneath the water. At first, the flashes appear as barely noticeable reflections. They flicker for a moment and disappear. But if you stay by the lake longer, the picture changes. The light becomes brighter, the flashes longer, and their shape more complex. Sometimes the flashes form circles that spread across the water, as if something from the depths had touched the surface. Sometimes they form streaks, reminiscent of thin lightning bolts living beneath the surface. But the main thing is that the light always comes from below. The first mentions of Turval date back to ancient Sami legends. People believed the lake was the boundary between worlds, and the flashes appeared when the spirits of the deep communicated with each other. Elders said the light was the voice of the water, which could foretell the future. In those days, people didn't go to the lake without a special reason, and the appearance of flashes was considered an important sign. Good if the light was soft, and alarming if the flashes became sharp and frequent. Modern researchers have attempted to explain the phenomenon by bioluminescence. Some seas do indeed contain organisms that glow. But Turval is a cold freshwater lake, and its depths are devoid of such life. Not a single water sample has revealed the presence of microorganisms capable of producing such light. Moreover, the glow often appears in winter, under the ice, when biological activity is virtually non-existent. The glow penetrates the thickness of the ice, leaving soft blue spots resembling frozen stars. One fisherman reported that one night the light seemed to follow his boat. He noticed the light flickering every time his oar dipped into the water. But when he tried to touch the light with his hand, he felt only cold, no warmth, no vibration. However, he claimed the water in the areas where the lights were flickering seemed denser than usual, as if something inside was creating a compaction invisible to the human eye. An even stranger incident occurred with a young woman who decided to photograph the flashes. She stood on the shore, watching the lights slowly move underwater. Each time a flash occurred, the camera captured an unusual blur, as if the light was forming a brief image. The woman showed the photo to her neighbors, and they insisted it showed something resembling runes or lines. But the images themselves were too blurry to make out. Locals say the flashes have a character. They can appear only on certain nights, when the air is especially still, when the sky is clear, or conversely, when a dense fog hangs over the forests. Sometimes the light is soft and smooth, like breathing. Other times it is sharp and swift, like a warning. Elders believe the lake responds to people. If a person comes with anxiety, the flashes behave erratically. If a person is calm, the light becomes steady. Scientists attempted to explore the depths of Tirval. They lowered cameras underwater, but the equipment malfunctioned. The recordings were short and fragmented. Occasionally, they showed something resembling a pulsating light, but then the image would distort. Some instruments showed pressure surges at great depth, despite no changes in the weather. It seemed as if there was a hidden energy source somewhere below, emitting intermittently. The stories of people who have seen flashes in the fog are particularly frightening. On such nights, the fog hangs low over the water, and light filters through it, creating blurred, three-dimensional shapes. Some say they've seen shadows, wide, tall, rising briefly above the surface. They resemble human silhouettes, but too tall to be real. These silhouettes disappear as quickly as they appear. Some believe it's a trick of the light. Others are convinced it's something inside the lake that refuses to fully reveal itself. Legend has it that an old shaman once drowned in Tirval. He carried with him sacred symbols that were meant to seal the passage between worlds. But no one ever found his body. People said that after his disappearance, the blazes grew stronger. Some claim that the light that appears underwater is an echo of his power, trapped between the world of the living and the world of spirits. Several years ago, a group of researchers decided to test whether sound affected the flashes. They set up powerful speakers on the shore and began playing various low-frequency vibrations. After a few minutes, the flashes indeed intensified. The light became brighter and its movement accelerated. But then something strange happened. The water began to rise in small waves, even though there was no wind. It seemed as if the lake was responding to the sound. The experiment was abandoned, and the researchers never repeated it. Some locals claim the flashes can interact with a person's emotions. One man said he once came to the lake after a heated argument. The light underwater grew sharper and brighter until he felt intense fear. He ran away. Later, when he returned calmer, the flashes were soft, almost gentle. These words sound mystical, but many locals repeat similar stories. The most mysterious manifestation of the Tirvala aurora occurs once every few years, during the so-called Blue Night. On such a night, the entire perimeter of the lake is illuminated by a faint light, similar to the reflection of the northern lights. This glow does not originate from the sky, but rather emerges from the depths. On this night, people say the water becomes mirror-like, and the aurora rises higher than usual, creating the sensation that the lake is breathing. Some claim to hear a faint singing during such moments, indistinct, barely perceptible, like a distant choir. The lake's flashes of light remain a mystery. They defy the laws of physics, provide no clear answers, and never repeat themselves. But one thing is clear: the lake is alive. It reacts to the world around it, to people, to sounds, to the night. And when another cold light flares in the depths, it feels as if Tirval is trying to say something. But we don't yet understand its language. Our world seems well explored, but behind its familiar surface lie places where logic loses its force and reality becomes more subtle. These mysteries don't require faith. They demand attention. We need only listen, look closely, take a step toward the unknown, and the world reveals what lies hidden between the lines of our everyday existence. The secrets are close at hand. We only need to notice.